People began to discover this nature within themselves, this higher nature of a person that was not depressed or anxious, or who was feeling suicidal thoughts or whatever it might have been. Underneath the veil of the narrative, which is this constant, incessant, negative story that many people who are suffering from stress and addictions and depression, this constant narrative keeps running and running and running. And this is the narrative of the personality, which is a mask that we wear. And what we discovered, once we started to really take these changes, these drastic healings and changes and transformations in people seriously, we started to discover that once they disidentified from this narrative, from this perpetual story of thoughts and feelings, perceptions, attitudes, and traits that were basically now automated, in other words, much like a computer program, when they disidentified from that stream of thoughts and consciousness, they really began to heal quite rapidly and quite deeply. So people were presenting from all over the world different problems. And the weird thing that we didn't expect to discover was that the way through these problems, some extreme, some 20 years of depression, clinical depression, very, very chronic anxiety, panic disorders. People were in nightmares. They were in a mental health crisis with medications as much of their only hope, and it wasn't working. So we knew something had to be done, and that's when we started to really take pen to paper about 13, 14 years ago, and we started to analyze people with all these different problems, different geographic locations, different ages, and so on, coming to a central hub, which was our Center for Healing, and saying, listen, I've exhausted every opportunity. I've been to 5 psychiatrists. I've been in therapy for many years, and I've tried ketamine and ayahuasca. I've tried everything, and I can't get there. So we took pen to paper and started to take things seriously, noting how people, certain people were coming and healing themselves. And what we found we didn't expect to find, which was these real common people doing very, very uncommon things. And, the elixir was, well, it wasn't us, it was themselves. Well, to get to the main core issue of what was keeping people depressed and stressed and anxious was that they identified with the personality. And in fact, they thought that that's all that they were. So they identified with a construct, and every thought, every experience, every trait that they developed from those thoughts and experiences, every perception that they had, every memory and false memory, every feeling, emotion, every outcome, and every perceived outcome, all built up into this mask of personality. Of course, personality meaning mask, persona. And this persona became a veil, and it was literally a veil between their happiness and wellness and peace and a nightmare that was anxiety and fear and a sense of trappedness that they couldn't get out of. So the identification with the story, with the narrative of who they thought they were, coming in and saying, my 20-year depression, my negative childhood, my upbringing, which was so stressful, this had become who they thought they were. And when there was a disidentification with the personality, we saw that the narrative or the story that they were running was not really who they were. Underneath that, underneath this veil of the narrative, as we call it, or veil of ignorance, because we don't really know who the authentic self is yet. When we get beneath that, marvelous and wonderful things, really, that we know nothing about, start to effervescently sort of emerge, and we become far, far greater beings than we ever thought that we were, and beings that are capable of healing the mind, body, heart. As you think, so shall you be. And when you identify with something that's not real, you suffer. And the personality, which again is our thoughts, feelings, perceptions, attitudes, traits, all these things, when we identify with the unreal, we suffer, because only the truth is going to set us free. So we started seeing this truth setting people free, this authenticity that we'd heard so much about over the years starting to come alive. We've all heard of the authentic self, we've all heard of spiritual awakenings and so on, but an authentic self is where healing resides. It's not something we expected to find. So it was beauty, truth, and goodness that emerged from people, that actually set them free from a frightened, fearful personality that had often kept them in states of absolute frozenness, of fight, flight, and freeze that were very, very deep and so rehearsed and so thought of over and over again. And of course, when a thought rehearsed over and over again is something that becomes a belief. And as you think, so shall you be becomes who you believe you really are. And if that ain't you, you're going to suffer. You're going to be in pain until you're set free. Because I think life is about becoming who we really are, which is really rooted in our values. It's rooted in, generally, people are great. They're kind, loving, open. We'll jump into an ocean or rescue people out of a burning building, people that are strangers, on instinct. But yet we develop these thick exterior masks that defend us, where we don't speak to family for 10 years, where we cut people off, we become angry, we become victims of violent people, and we become people that are separate. And of course, when we believe we're separate, we suffer even more. Separation leads to anxiety, and anxiety is separation anxiety. So this is how things are born, and it's something that really we're doomed to suffer. We're doomed to make these choices to survive when we're young. But there comes a time, and usually that time is through some suffering, that we realize, look, I need to be free. I need to, ask that famous 3-word sentence of, who am I? And when that starts to emerge, this is spiritual awakening. This is spiritual work. And by that, all we mean is looking inside instead of looking towards that environment that created that narrative. Our parents, people, places, things, conversations, and situations that we thought were who we were. But they're a narrative. And at the end of the day, they're a veil. So when we disidentify with the veil, with the masks of persona, we also disidentify with codependence, things we needed, codependence. We disidentify with being a victim and a people pleaser and so on and so forth. What we've created is something beautiful for people called the paradigm process. And it's pretty simple, really. We take, the 10 most common masks that we wear, and we find an antidote for each of these masks. And, our need for control and judgment and so on, we find a pathway back, which is, self-love, gratitude, authenticity, and so on. So these 10 simple pathways are to just remove the construct of the veil of that narrative, which has become our attitude, our traits, our personality. So once we start removing those consciously, with conscious awareness, with contemplative mindsets. In other words, when we are able to use the tools of mindfulness, of being able to see this narrative, with practice, you can see it straight away. These automatic, redundant, almost useless thoughts. These thoughts are not us either. They're there. You don't even choose these thoughts really. They just run perpetually and constantly and sort of rehearse us into trying to be safe, which of course doesn't work. Freedom comes by removing the veil, by removing the masks, and allowing our authenticity to emerge. Thinking that we're rotten, bad people is inherent, and you won't believe what a bit of work on self-love can do. Something that people don't realize is almost a dirty word. And self-love and growth and contribution and all of these paradoxes bring joy and set us free. Defense brings nothing but war, suffering, and rehearsing of survival techniques. At 3 o'clock in the morning, that's what we're doing until we show up. We emerge through that veil and say, I'm not the mind. I'm not even the body. I'm not this matter. We start to really ask those questions of who am I? Where have I been? Where am I going? We can take pen to paper. Pen is definitely mightier than the sword, and we can begin to work on ourselves. We can do it through talk therapies. We can do it through meditative practice and through contemplation. So it's quite strange that when we get beyond this veil of the narrative, I ask, who are you without your story? And people that are able to stop long enough and actually consider that question, because it's a frightening question in the beginning that can even set some people's nervous systems off. Alarms go off and they're having a panic attack, or they're suffering generalized anxiety or avoidance, or trying to distract themselves. Anything but look at who we are without the story. And the mind is very afraid it's going to find something frightening and worse, which never happens. Well, we haven't seen it happen yet. What we've seen emerge is beauty, truth, and goodness in people. We've seen the need for anxiety, the need for depression, for staying connected to those post-traumatic stress scenarios that play out again and again and again like a nightmare. We're not saying you get rid of your personality, really. We're saying transcend it and include it, story and all. Dissolve and integrate that personality into your emerging, authentic self, which is really a beautiful journey. Discovering who we really are, who other people really are, who God is, and what this constructed universe is all about, is something that is actually one of the most beautiful things that we've ever discovered. So it's developing a self-love will develop a love for others, and it'll develop a love for God, universe, nature, and so on. And this contemplative intelligence, this disidentification with narrative, is something that can really transform the self first, but then transform the world. It can, you can't be racist, discriminatory, when you're not judging people with that judge, insurgent personality mask. And when we become free, so do others. So there is a great, great shift happening, and we shouldn't be disheartened, where people are really waking up, and pretty much it's out of necessity. Mental health crisis, COVID, not being able to trust the government maybe as much as you could, really having to turn inwards and discover the essence of the self, which is the journey. Relax.